Welcome back to Morbidly Bewitched. In this episode, I take you to the Andes for a tragic tale, the plane crash. Stay tuned. So if you haven't already, please subscribe. There should be a wee button coming up that I'm quite proud of because I had to look up how to get it attached. And for all of you people that love podcasts, I'm doing the same on a podcast channel, same name, Morbidly Bewitched, if you want to drift off into nightmares with me whispering in your ear. On the 13th of October, 1972, a chartered plane, the Fairchild Flight 571, crashed high up in the Andes Mountains, carrying 40 passengers and 5 crew. This is a very well documented story. I'm sure you're probably aware of it, but again, it's one of the classics I just cannot leave out. With 40 people in a group, majority of them being rugby players, some of their family members came along as well, which made up the number of 40, and then the 5 crew on board the flight. The atmosphere would have been fantastic. They all were part of a team and they would have been completely innocent to what lay ahead of them. Now, the weather was not good. They had to make a stopover flight whenever they were partially en route to Mendoza because the weather wasn't good. But one of the captains, an extremely seasoned veteran pilot with thousands of air miles experience behind him, who had done this trip many times before, decided that at 18 minutes past 2 in the evening the next day, they would go ahead and try to make it across the Andes, because the guy had the experience and the knowledge to make that judgment call. But it wasn't actually him that was in charge of the flight that day. It was Lugara, who was the co-pilot and had never flew the route before and didn't have just as much experience. They radioed the airport to say that they expected to be at the passover point at about 20 past 3, which was from one side of the mountain to the other. They then planned to make a northern descent down into Santiago. As they made their way through the Andes, the weather still hadn't improved and the cloud obscured the vision of Lugara, which completely disorientated him. Turned out the plane was not on the right route at all and they had turned right to make that descent far too early, which meant whenever they seen through the clouds, I've got some diagrams here. The Andes, there's the plane. So he thought he was about up here somewhere. These are knives from my kitchen, by the way. But he was actually down here somewhere. Whenever he could see through the clouds and he was coming along, he seen this and realised his misjudgment and tried with all of his might. He put that plane on full power because he was facing the whole north ridge of the Andes Mountains whenever he could see properly. And he put full power on. They were hitting turbulence. The plane was dropping and dipping. Even the rugby players at this stage didn't think, well, it's that typical scenario where you think, well, it's not going to happen to me. They even joked and said, should we be that close to the mountains? And a couple of nervous laughs kind of rang out when they were hitting their turbulence and dipping and getting on. There was cheers and laughs from everybody. But it wasn't to be laughed at, because what happened next was he had full power on. He just managed to get the nose of the plane over the mountain, but the tail clipped. Which put the plane into a spin. It came down over the top of the mountain. Then the plane crashed into the mountain about 2 or 3 times. breaking away the entire tail and a good portion of the fuselage. Just like that. When the tail was ripped off, it also ripped away 2 rows of seats, and it instantly killed 2 passengers. It took them with it. But in the meantime, we're still in full-on crash mode here. So the plane had got to the other side, the tail has ripped away. It starts hitting down the mountain, and at this stage then, it loses its wings. They just got ripped off. So this guy is now hurtling down the mountain like a massive version of a toboggan, and then it hit a sheer glacier wall. Like that. The final resting place was about 11,710 feet on a glacier which bordered a really desolate area between Chile, the border of Chile and Argentina. Because this was a chartered flight, there was reports sent out immediately, and it was recognised that this plane should have landed, that it had disappeared. Rescues were sent out to try and see if they could see anything, but this was a sheer white plane body against snow. So they missed it on quite a number of occasions because it blended into the background. Out of the 45, 3 passengers and 2 of the crew members died during the tail separation. One died after unfortunately walking from the plane and falling into really deep snow and asphyxiated. He couldn't breathe. And 4 died immediately on impact, which left 35 out of the 45 survivors of the initial crash. But that is not the number of survivors in the end. What lay ahead of these poor people was 72 days of absolute hell on earth. After the crash, the stronger out of the group, the ones that were not injured, which is crazy, looked after and tended to the most injured at the time. They tried to make a shelter out of what was left of the plane by stacking up all of their luggage out and around the areas with holes in them so that there was basically one way to get in and out, and it would protect them from the elements. But to say that food was a sorry state of affairs, there was nothing really on board. There was even reports from one of the guys that said he can remember holding on to 1 chocolate-covered peanut for 3 days. He actually held it in his hand. He sucked all of the chocolate off it on day 1. Day 2, he just sucked on the peanut. Then he gradually allowed himself to take a tiny wee nibble off it until there was nothing left. Now, for you to do that with 1 chocolate-covered peanut, you are in sheer desperation. They even used the aluminium that backed the seats to heat up snow when the sun was shining through the day, to melt it into drinking water. At those kind of altitudes, the body cannot heal or survive just as well as it can at ground level. Whenever you are 11,710 feet up, the oxygen's depleted, which means you can't heal as well, and your body essentially slowly starts to eat itself because it can't cope with that environment. This then led them to the scenario that this plane crash was best known for: cannibalism. Now, these guys quite literally argued over this for days, and it was something they all felt terrible about, but they used shards of glass to fillet the flesh from the backs of people's thighs and the buttocks to begin to consume the dead. And I really don't know why something like this is so badly frowned upon. And I really wouldn't. You wouldn't have to twist my arm. We are meat. we are meat. We're a species. At the end of the day, we are meat. People seem to put themselves onto this pedestal of being above that kind of use, but I really don't see what I just don't see what the problem is. The only thing I would say is it wouldn't have been palatable, if that's the word to use, because they did not have the provisions to light a fire, and that meant that they were essentially chewing on extremely cold, frozen flesh. I can't imagine that would have been palatable at all. An avalanche then gave way a few weeks into their horrendous ordeal and hurtled down the mountain straight towards their makeshift bunker. This killed off more of the survivors and left them with very little room to come and go. A very small space they had to dig out, reshape with luggage to try and make some kind of accommodation, because they thought at this stage they weren't even going to get saved. I'm sure they probably thought at that point every man and his dog was against them, because they just faced one obstacle after another, until eventually a couple of brave souls from the group realized, we're not going to get saved here, we have to save ourselves. So they headed off into the Andes, headed north. They had no idea how long they would have to trek for. Automatic cat feeder, ironically. They had no idea how long they'd have to trek for, and they trekked for days. They took frozen slices of meat with them as sustenance, but needless to say, by the time they came across any form of civilization, they were starving, hypothermic, fatigued, emaciated. I don't even know how they had the energy to keep going, but they did. They eventually came across a stream, and they could see the remnants of life left behind by others. There was rusted, used, empty cans of soup. There was a horseshoe. There was other signs of life along with this river. They followed the flow of the river until, God of mercy, they seen a man on horseback. So this man seen them. He was on the other side of the river, and they were shouting at him to say we were in a plane crash, who they were, but the river was so loud that the man couldn't even hear them. So they used strips of paper, and they scribbled down a note onto this paper to throw it, attach it to a rock and throw it across the river to this guy in sheer desperation. Help, we need help. The first one rolled back into the water, so they had to go at it again, but second attempt did the trick. The guy picked it up, he read it, and he put a thumbs up that he understood the predicament these guys was in. Search and rescue helicopters were deployed immediately, and they screamed up the mountain. And to say who was left behind was elated doesn't really come close. There isn't really a word, I suppose, to describe how these guys must have felt whenever they eventually seen these saviors coming through the air. Out of the entire 45, 16 survived the crash. That's including after 72 days of grueling, horrible, horrendous conditions and cannibalism. They were took to the nearest hospital in Chile, where they received food, they got showered, and warm blankets. It is known affectionately as the Miracle of the Andes, and the area where the plane crashed is known as the Glacier of Tears for extremely obvious reasons. Join me in my next video for more morbidly bewitching tales from around the world, and I will see you soon.